Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.
Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and as always I'm joined by my co-presenter John Dorney from theirishstory.com. Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by Radio Archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie. You can follow us on Twitter at Irish History Pod or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. If you get a chance, please take a moment to rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or whichever platform you get your podcasts on, as it really helps us. If you'd like to listen to any previous episodes of the show, you can go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. This week, we're very pleased to be joined by Mick O'Reilly. Mick's autobiography, From Lucifer to Lazarus, A Life on the Left, has just been published by the Lilliput Press and is available from all good bookstores and online. Mick, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Now, first, I think we should really ask you, because it's a really interesting book. We both got a copy of it and had a read of it, and I really enjoyed it. But what got you first interested in socialism? When did you first develop your class consciousness?
That's a very interesting question. I'll do my best to answer it. It has two parts. One is a sort of an intellectual or curiosity about reading, which happened to me in my teens when I started to work in a company called Lincoln & Nowlands. But the other is an earlier thing, which I think is not intellectual but instinctive. And what I mean by that is this: there's a story in the book about my communion. I was bought a Crombie coat and a blue serge suit, which was brought in Francis Street Market. And I remember going to the church with one of my pals from beside me, and he had no coat. And there are no words for this because I wouldn't have had the words, but I had a feeling that the coat kindled some kind of difference between us. And I got angry at having the coat. I took her off and hid it in a garden in Thomond Road. And later I found the coat because I can still see a picture of my mother's face, because she would have went up to see us march up from the school. It was in Ballyfermot, march up from the school. So I think I wouldn't call that socialism, but I would call it a kind of an instinct for fairness or justice that a lot of children, I think, have. And maybe it's knocked out of them because of the particular world that they go into and the values that they have to assume. And that's part of it. The other part of it is something that happened to me when I went to work. I'd worked in a lot of places. And I remember I was sacked. I worked in a place called Howard's. They used to manufacture women's clothes, and I was a Hoffman presser. There were only 3 men that worked there, and there was a payment by result system. Anyway, put the long story short, there was a bus strike, as there often was in Dublin in those days. It would have been probably about 1960, 61. Anyway, my sister used to give me a lift home on her scooter, and he told me I had to work overtime, and I told him I couldn't, but I could come in early the next morning. And there and then he just sacked me. And when I was only 14 or 15, and I was absolutely outraged at his power over me. And I got interested in trade unionism actually from that. And eventually I went to work in a place called Lincoln & Nowlands. And I had worked in a lot of other places in between 14 and 16. You had to be 60, you had to start there at your 16th birthday. And it was the 21st of October, 1962. It was 1:30 of the day. I went in and I was interviewed by a man called Tom Dent, who was the foreman. he gave me the job. I was to start in the stores, and he put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Go over there and see Billy Wheatley. He's the shop steward, and he'll fix you up with a union card." And at the same time, in that factory, there was a small group of people. Now, say in Lincoln and Nolans, I would say there was 400 or 500 people working. Would have been probably less than a dozen people. They used to say the rosary at 1:30 in the day. And I went over to Billy Wheatley and I told him I wanted to join the union. He gave me the form and he started talking to me. And he said to me, "You don't mind them down there." He said, "They're praying for overtime." And he said, "You join the union and we get you time and a half for it." And I just knew he had said something. Now, Ireland was a very religious place at that time. And I just knew he had said something profound to me. And it went into my computer. And I went over it again and again and again. And it may be what he was saying to me. If you want to change the world, you combine with other people here. You don't ask for somebody, some sky god, to do something for you by praying to them. Now, if I'd have said that to Billy Wheatley, he'd have laughed at me. I don't think he would have had that kind of meaning to it. But that's the meaning I eventually figured out of what he was saying to me. And so it made a powerful impact on me. And I remember in the factory, because they used to sell the United Irishman, and it's the first time I came across the magazine, the Irish Socialist. It used to be in the factory. I wouldn't say that nobody sold it, but you'd see odd copies of it lying around the place. And of course, everybody read every paper. You'd have the Irish Times, the Press, and the Independent. And you could read all the papers because they were all shared around the plant. And, you know, I kind of got interested in trade unionism for that. And I remember going to my first union meeting. It was an increase, a national increase of 12%. I had worked with all these men. They were working there. And we went down. The meeting started, I think, at 7:30 in the old Liberty Hall. And I seen all these guys, and they had what they used to call Sunday suits on them. You know, they were shaved, they were dressed, they were whatever. And what amazed me about it was they were so articulate in relation. I don't remember all the arguments now they made, but they were able to stand up and speak. And the people on the platform spoke. And I remember thinking to myself, I'd love to get involved in this. This is really a kind of an interesting thing. I got interested in trade unionism from that. I don't know if that answers the question.
Yeah, Mick, can you tell us something about the kind of political and social climate in Dublin in those days? Because, you know, we think back to the 50s and 60s and think of it as a time of, on the one hand, very conservative politics, very strong Catholic Church, very high immigration, housing shortage. Was it like that, or was it more interesting than that?
Well, it was certainly like that, but like in any society where there's a dominant view like that, there are also other views. There are also dissenting views, however small those dissenting views might be. And one of the things that got me interested in communism was I went to see a cowboy picture called Vera Cruz, and Burt Lancaster was in it, and he played a kind of a group to Gary Cooper was in it. But anyway, I became fascinated with Burt Lancaster, and I used to try and go see all these films. And I remember he'd done a thing on the BBC called The War in the East. And it was about the Soviet Union. He narrated the thing. It was a documentary. And I looked at it. It was about the Soviet Union's role in the Second World War. Now, if you were reared in Dublin at that time, you would think kind of the Americans and the British won the war, or that maybe the eloquence of Winston Churchill's speeches had absolutely flattened the German army. When I seen this film, it absolutely stuck with me. And Burt Lancaster read out one fact that I have never forgotten. He said, out of every 5 German soldiers killed, the Red Army killed 4 of them. I have never forgotten that fact. And any amount of propaganda that I was surrounded by or seeing, I was able to see to find out in the Dublin that I lived in. There's an awful lot of spin going on here. And so that had a big kind of impact on me. That's a very peculiar way to come to a sense world history. But that made a kind of an impact on me. And to this day, I think that, you see the celebrations, if you call the word celebration, you see the various things that are done to commemorate the Second World War and the D-Day landings and all like that. And the Russians, even now, are largely excluded from all these events, which I think is absolutely shocking.
Yeah, it's interesting as well, though, Mick. You mentioned like things like the United Irishman and things like that. And in those days, what you tended to see a lot of is people going into radical politics from kind of the Irish Republican movement. Was that something that was common to you, or something that you saw?
No, I have to say, one of the things that rankled with me when I was young was a big question mark over the actual revolution itself, the idea of Irish independence. I used to often say to myself, well, if the British had never left here, I'd have probably been able to go to university. Now, that may sound a strange thing to say, and I didn't really become a proper Irish Republican until I went to England, which was much later, and when I started to read James Connolly. So in my early youth, I was very interested in class politics, and I began to read Marx and I began to read Connolly. And for me, the motor of human history, then and now, is the struggle of classes. Of course, the struggle of classes takes place within nations, and I was later to know the historian Desmond Graves and various other people in the communist movement, and I became convinced that the working class movement must champion the idea of national independence and self-determination. And I still see self-determination as a very important and progressive idea. I think if the British Labour movement and if Corbyn had spent more time reading James Connolly and championed that cause, perhaps the Tories wouldn't have been able to rob the flag in the Brexit debate. But anyway, that's another story.
Well, Mick, could you talk about that time when you moved to England? Because it's a very interesting part of your book, the connections that you made with people on the British left and also the Irish communities in those British industrial cities that you became a part of.
Yeah, well, I think it's important just to say that I tried to force join the Communist Party in Dublin. And I went into the bookshop. The Communist Party had a bookshop in Pearse Street, the end of Pearse Street. And I went into a man there called John Nolan, who actually had been involved in the campaign to bring Larkin back from America and was associated. He was a friend of young Jim Larkin, and he was very active in communist politics. And, as I say, had been at this business from about 1923. And to get a picture of this guy, just imagine you're looking at BBC Two, and it's Saturday night, and Captain Mannering is on, because that's who he was. He was an absolute ringer for Captain Mannering. I've said before that I think the BBC producer accidentally met him and invented Captain Mannering from his engagement with Johnny Nolan. But anyway, he was there in the bookshop, and I asked, could I join the Communist Party? And he looked at me and said, I don't know anything about them. Come to the wrong place, kind of thing. He really put me off the idea altogether. Now, they wouldn't have been able to take me in anyway because they had no youth movement and you couldn't join the party until you were 18 years of age. But if he'd have said that to me, I would have accepted it. He denied all knowledge of the whole thing altogether. And I knew he was telling me lies or putting me off, and I was quite embarrassed. Anyway, I bought a book, and I bought the Daily Worker, and I bought speeches of Harry Potter. I can remember the books that I bought. And I walked out to the door, and he walked after me, and he looked up, almost addressing Pearse Street rather than me. And he said, we've been accused of a lot of things, and I wouldn't like to add kidnapping children to it. And I was absolutely, to say I was furious at him is the understatement of the 20th century. I killed him. I really didn't like what he'd done. By the way, later we were to become bosom pals. I got to know him, and he was a font of information and knowledge and dedication and all that. But that day was not a good day for me to be asked to train out. Anyway, there was a row in the factory, and I had all kinds of difficulties in the Nolans. And I left, and I went to Britain, and I went to Coventry. The first thing I'd done, actually, I went away with a pal of mine, deceased now, a great pal of mine, called Bernard Brown. The two of us went away together, and we joined it and went away in '65, and we joined the Communist Party. Just to give the picture of this at the time, there was about 40,000 members in the Communist Party at that time. Had a big intellectual tradition, had no members of parliament, a few councillors here and there. They had two members of parliament in the up to the late 50s, I think. No, mid 50s. But their influence was enormous in the trade union movement, absolutely enormous. And they had a great tradition. So I joined the Coventry branch of the party, which was very interesting because there was a few Irish people in it. But the other thing it had was it had an intellectual tradition, because a lot of the intellectuals from Warwick University used to attend the meeting. And that always fascinated me. The way intellectuals and workers would be together in the party, arguing the toss with something. There was no question of looking up to intellectuals. They were comrades as far as we were concerned. They shared our ideas, and they worked for the cause of the party. So I joined the Communist Party, and one of the most influential people over me at that time was a man called Harry Bourne. Now, I couldn't pronounce his first name. That's not his name. He chopped it off because he was a Polish Jew, and his name has every letter in the alphabet in it. Don't ask me to pronounce it, but he was known in the party as Harry Bourne. And he had fought with the Free Poles in Britain with the British Army, and he had fought in for the Republicans in Spain. And he was a fantastic character. He was a full-time organizer for the party. And I've met a lot of people in the party who fought in Spain. And I have to say that every political cause on this earth has heroes. The Nazis have heroes, and the Red Army has heroes, the Americans, the British, and the IRA, and the UDA. Everybody's got heroes. And all these heroes have one thing in common. They all fought for their own place. But the 40-odd thousand volunteers who went to stand with the Republicans in Spain and fight Franco and the fascists, they were unique because they fought for somebody else's place. And I think they are the most unique group in the history of any war, anywhere. I don't know any parallel with the International Brigade anywhere. And I suppose most of them were communists, but not all of them, because they never described themselves as communists or socialists. They only described themselves as anti-fascist. And he was a fantastic character, and he made a big impact on me. Now, I have to say, he was also a pea-green hardliner, Stalinist. He didn't like the modernization of the party. There was a big argument going on, because at that time, the daily paper was called the Daily Worker, nearly 50 years ago now, and they were talking about changing the name to the Morning Star. And there's a lot that went with that, about adoption, about being more modern, and so on and so forth. And there was a to and fro of those kinds of politics. And it was the fallout of what had happened in the Soviet Union from the 20th Party Congress, the denunciation of Stalin, the idea of embracing and putting democracy at the center of the struggle for socialism, as it always should be. So Harry was on the wrong side of that, the different side of it to me. But notwithstanding the fact that I disagreed with him over things, I still admired him. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I admired a lot of these people who I didn't agree with, because I admired what they had done in the movement.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a kind of a person who is a kind of a heroic personality. I think, and people admire them for those qualities, I think. But my next question, though, Mick, you touched on there is like, you were part of a worldwide movement, and the center of it was the Soviet Union, and you might touched on there, the Khrushchev era and the thaw. And what was the thinking in world communism or in the communist movement at the time about what was the way forward for socialism?
Well, I remember reading a pamphlet. I think the title of it was 80 million communists say, or maybe 46 million communists say. It was a reflection of a meeting of the international communist movement. Now, I have to say, at that time, when I joined the party, there was no center. It was not one movement. Each party had autonomy, etc., to go its own way towards socialism, to draw up its own program, to reflect its own culture, its own history, its own background, all of that. That was very much the flow of things from the Soviet Union. There was also a big debate on culture, because the Communist Party had, in the Soviet Union, had interfered with culture, suppressed writers, everything that Marx had said you shouldn't do. The Russians had kind of made every mistake in the book, and everything wrong that you could do, they'd done it. And they'd done it, in an abundance with Stalin. And obviously, many communists were murdered for their political views under the Stalin regime. I think it's an absolutely horrible thing that anybody should lose their life as a result of having different political views to somebody else. And that happened in the Soviet Union on a gigantic scale. But the way I thought of that, I admired the fact that they opened the book on this and they said what they had done. After all the religions of the world have engaged in mass murder of their opponents over different interpretations of the Bible and so on and so forth. All the political parties, all the Western countries have all engaged in wars and colonial conquest and racism and all the rest of it. But the Soviets had opened the book on this, and I thought that was a strength and not a weakness. Now, I have to say, I overestimated the degree to which the change had happened in the Soviet Union. So when I joined the Communist Party, the minority were the people who followed Stalin, or the people who followed the Soviet Union, and the majority had turned their back on that.
Well, Mick, we might move on to your return to Ireland and joining the Communist Party over here. And I think one of the things that people might find interesting is the Communist Party was partitioned along with the country. You had a separate Communist Party in the north and a separate Communist Party in the south. How did that work out in practice, or did they have any differing views towards the national question, depending on whether you were in Dublin or Belfast?
No, they had no different view on the national question. Of course, the Communist Party during the Second World War, had grown to be quite a size in Belfast. There were probably about 2,000 members in the Communist Party in Belfast during the war years, because the whole Soviet Union was working with Great Britain, fighting fascism, fighting Hitler, and the war effort was supported by the trade union movement, by the Communist Party, by the left, by the Labour Party. There was, in effect, in Britain, in the British state at that time, what people now call war communism. In other words, everything was mobilized by the state for one thing, and that was the destruction of Nazi Germany. So the British state, the role of the state in industry, in agriculture, in general culture of the country, in every state was involved in mobilizing the whole of the nation, and they were very much behind that. And so, workers, particularly unionist workers, were very much inclined to listen to the propaganda of the party, and the main emphasis was on defeating Hitler. Now, the absolute opposite of the case was in the 26 counties, where Eamon de Valera, I think correctly, had argued that we would remain neutral during the war. And that's how the party really couldn't function down here with the level of censorship. So as a result of that, remnants of the Communist Party here joined the Labour Party. And most of them, not all of them, but most of them were in the Dublin Central branch. And actually the two Larkins, Jim Larkin the Junior and old Jim Larkin, the original Jim Larkin, were in that branch as well. And it's well known that the Communist Party run that branch of the Labour Party, very, very dynamic organisation at that time, and they campaigned on all the issues of the day. So it was after the war, when there was a purge in the Labour Party, and the bishops insisted that they take certain things out of their constitution, like the idea of a workers' republic was taken out of the constitution of the Labour Party at the behest of the Irish bishops. Would you believe it? But that's actually what happened. And there was a purge against the communists, and many of them were expelled from the party, and they started the party again. The Irish Workers' League started in, I think, in 1947. And they immediately established a joint council with the party in Northern Ireland, the Communist Party of Northern Ireland. And that reunited in the 1971, I think. That was the background to that. They simply found that they couldn't function really down here during the war years. But they always had the same analysis of the partition. They wanted to overcome partition. They wanted the British disengagement from the island of Ireland, and so on and so forth. Now, I'm not saying that, unionists, those who represented unionist workers every day made that the central issue. If you were representing workers in the shipyard or in Ireland and Wolf or wherever, obviously you have to adapt principles to the circumstances you find yourself in, and you have to do fancy footwork and so on and so forth. But they always had a principled position on the national question. In the same way that the only party in Britain that campaigned ceaselessly against the partition of Ireland was the British Communist Party. Every other political party in Britain accepted the partition of Ireland.
Well, Mick, I might ask you as well about your role in the Connolly youth movement and building up a youth movement for communism at that time. How did you find that? Did you find it was difficult, or were people receptive at that stage, young people looking for a left-wing alternative?
Well, I didn't want to join the Connolly youth. I didn't believe it. I mean, this comes from, the communists are obsessed with the idea of youth movements. It comes from, I think, 2 or 3 sentences Lenin said in one of his pamphlets or books about, you have to get young people in. And I didn't want to join the Connolly youth movement until I was prevailed upon by the General Secretary, who put his arm on my shoulder one day and said, the Connolly youth movement needs you, Mick, they're joining. That's the way the Communist Party worked. The General Secretary put his hand on your shoulder, Mick O'Reilly. He didn't say no to him. He suggested that I could do good work. So I joined the Connolly youth movement. And I got on, I have to say, I got on fantastically well in it. I really enjoyed my time in it. I became involved in the Dublin House Election Committee and a host of kind of campaigns. We started a paper called Change, and then with the second paper called Forward. We sold it around the pubs, which was, quite a difficult thing to do in the early 60s. When you were selling the pub either the Irish Socialist or the youth paper, you were taking your life in your hands. Anything could happen to you selling the pub. There was a tendency to get into a lot of rows because there was a lot of anti-communism about the place at that time. Oh yeah, I was involved in the youth movement, and I took to it, took the water, but I was reluctant to join it.
That's interesting. You mentioned about the anti-communism, Mick, that was prevalent at the time. Like that, that's outside of the experience of the current generation. Can you just talk about what that was like, or what people thought about communism generally?
Well, I remember just after the Soviet intervention in Czechoslovakia, we had a big headline in the paper denouncing it. And I was up in a pub in Ballyfermot called Tim Young's. I never forgot this. And it was packed. It was Friday night. I was selling the paper. I think the paper was 4 pence. And this guy said, "Well, I'll have one of them." And he said, "Give me the 4 pence." So instead of giving me the money, he dropped it on the floor. 1, 2, 3, 4. On the floor. The pub was packed. So I had to kind of get down on my knees, pick up the 4 pence, and I was going out. And he then tore up the paper and used a lot of expedients to me and told me to get out of the pub, you see. So I just walked out of the pub, And as soon as I walked out of the pub, when I went outside, the head barman, said to me, "You're an effing troublemaker." He said, "And never come into this pub again. Everywhere you go," he said, "you communists, you just start trouble."
And like,
the newspaper. That was, it wasn't that. I wouldn't say the tension was like that all the time. But you could be. People would approach you and give out to you, over that. Particularly if the Soviet Union had done anything wrong, as though you personally were some way responsible for what the Red Army done in Czechoslovakia or whatever, even if you were denouncing it.
Yeah, I mean, back in the previous era, kind of in the 30s, there was like red baiting crowds. Like they tried to burn down, I think, Connolly House.
Yeah.
But that was another era, I think, yeah.
Yeah, that's true.
All right, I have another question, though, which is more about the 60s in Ireland. And, people think about that now as kind of the Lamas-Whitaker era. And, times were changing for the better. And did you see that on the ground? Or what was your perception of that at the time?
The exact opposite, because you see, there was the big debate going on inside Fianna Fáil, and indeed in Irish society generally, about the future of protectionism. And Sean Lemass was very much of a position that they should move away from protectionism. But he actually said that business was too important to be left to business people, and that the state should play a role in developing companies that could be used to export manufactured goods and so on and so forth. That was his position when they were in opposition. But when he got into office, and I think, and I have no evidence for this, but it's just what I think Whittaker, J.J. Whittaker, convinced them that that was not the way to go. That the way to go was to bring in multinationals into Ireland, not use the state so much, and that these multinationals, Irish companies, would be forced to emulate them, would learn from them, and we would develop an indigenous kind of capitalist culture ourselves, and we would develop export industries ourselves. Now, that didn't happen. We certainly brought in multinationals, and they were relatively successful in the sense that they created jobs and so on and so forth. But our autonomy to do our own thing was not enhanced. So I worked, of course, in a protected industry, as thousands of people did. I worked in the car industry. People forget that we used to manufacture, well, we didn't manufacture, we used to assemble cars in Ireland. And that was about, I think, 17, 18% of the manufacturing industry. And so we had a long campaign of opposition to both the Anglo-Irish Free Trade Agreement and to entry to the common market. But what we were able to do as car workers, we were able to win a protocol. In other words, we went into a free trade agreement with the common market. We decided to join the common market. But the rules of the common market did not apply to car workers. What happened was we were protected until we joined the common market in 1972, and we got a protection agreement for the workers up until 1984. And every employer in the industry was charged, if he wanted to bring in fully built up cars, he was charged with responsibility of developing suitable alternative employment. And I tell you that that was a great achievement of the trade union movement. When we were talking about, as we are still, exit and the British and all the rest of it, nobody was talking about how you do a transition. Because you can do a transition to a newer situation over time, and you can protect people if the goals are eventually got, because we eventually got to a situation where there was no car industry, but a lot of us got alternative jobs in the process, and we didn't go to a cliff. We negotiated a way off the cliff. And I think that was a great achievement of the trade union movement, and probably one of the best things that I and the shop steward in the car industry were able to do.
That's an interesting comment, Mick, about like the idea of growth, European integration and stuff like that, versus kind of the autonomy to plan our own economy. It's a contradiction, as Marxists might say, isn't it?
Well, the point of the exercise is Eamon de Valera was once asked about what we voted in the referendum to join the common market. Fianna Fáil were in favour of it. And he said in private, and Vivian, his son, told us that that meant he believed his father voted against it. And of course, he described himself as the last president of an Ireland that was free. And if you read, particularly Frank Aiken and De Valera, and indeed John Lamatte as well, up until the time he changed his position on it, if you read them, they were very, very sceptical about the whole idea of joining Europe. They certainly wanted to trade with Europe. They wanted freer trade, but they were more inclined to look at kind of a model of the Norwegians or the Swedes, to have an associate kind of relationship with the common market. And the real reason that they went for full membership had nothing to do with the common market. It had everything to do with the decision of Edward Heath. And if you read the propaganda at the time, that's exactly what they said. We will have to go in if the British go in.
Well, Mick, it's very interesting now, especially that we've all lived through the recent Brexit debates, that the way the media covers it, you'd assume that the only people who have questions or are skeptical about the EU are real reactionaries and right-wingers, that the whole left-wing argument, and particularly in Britain, like, the long tradition of questions about the EU coming from the left seems to have been completely excised from the debate.
Well, the point is they were. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. I mean, I think in the absence of Tony Benn, because Tony Benn had a very clear attitude to it. You see, this is the point. Self-determination. Self-determination is a progressive idea. The idea that somebody can make a law, and if you don't like that law, you can ultimately sack them. The idea that if you want the state involved in your industries, or you want to go in the direction of a more socialistic planned economy, then you have to have autonomy as a state to be able to do that. You can't do that in the common market. It is excluded by law. It's excluded by a constitution, right? So you don't have the freedom to do these things. And that's. I mean, it was. This all arose. The common market was really constructed by the Americans, in their view, after the Second World War. Because the only powers in Europe after the Second World War were really the Americans and the Red Army. Germany was a busted flush. France was finished. Britain was exhausted. So they were in the business of constructing something that would stand against sort of a socialist Europe or a more left-wing Europe. And they designed this common market thing very slowly. But the thing it absolutely excludes is the involvement of the state. The competition is in the actual constitution, and you must have it, and you can't interfere with it. By the way, the American Constitution has no such prohibition. If Donald Trump tomorrow, changed his mind and he wanted to nationalize certain industries and all the rest of it, he could do so. There's nothing in the American Constitution that prohibits him. But if somebody wanted to do that, if they decided to elect a left-wing government in France and they wanted to do that, they couldn't do it. It's prohibited by the Constitution.
Yeah, I mean, the counter-argument I've heard from trade unionists and left-wingers of that era who've spoken to me about it is that they were against the EEC as it then was at the time, but then they became converts to a thing called Social Europe in the 80s and 90s.
Well, certainly do believe. I mean, once we made the decision to join, obviously, and you had to reform Europe and do it in the. I would argue still that we need a more social Europe and we need to reform Europe. But the facts are, it's very difficult to see how you can do it. You have to get a majority in 27 countries. That each country can block another. It's very hard to say how the European Union can be reformed. And I think, by the way, one of the ways that it will be reformed is when the British leave. Because if the British get the deal, I think they might get, then a lot of people will want a different kind of Europe where there is more, control at the state. It amazes me that the debate now in Europe, one of the things the Europeans want to stop is the British using the state. The British, they created Thatcherism, the destruction of the state. But the British want to be able to use the state, a conservative administration. It's absolutely amazing. And the reason the British want to keep that there, as far as I can see, is the fact that it's about their sovereignty. They want to be able to make these decisions.
Well, Mick, I think we might move on now to your time in the Labour Party, which is very interesting. How that move came about from you leaving the Communist Party and entering the left of the Labour Party.
A big group of us, I'd say a big group of us, about 40 people, I think, 40 people left the Communist Party over the invasion of Czechoslovakia. Now, not when it happened, because when it happened, it was denounced and, that was accepted and we put it through. But there was a long kind of battle over the consequences of that inside the Communist Party. And we lost out. They eventually accepted the Soviet invasion was done for good reasons and that they had, prevailed and stopped Czechoslovakia moving away from socialism. That's something we could not and would never accept. So I left the Communist Party with many others. Now, most of the others joined the Labour Party. I didn't. Now, it coincided with the fact that I had taken up full-time employment in the union. I moved to Dundalk as a full-time official, and I was very busy in the union, to tell you the truth. After I had a branch of about 2,500 people. I had 90 sections to look after, and I was very busy. And as I say, they all joined the Labour Party, but I didn't. Until there was a row in the Labour Party. We were represented by a union official, Jimmy Tinkler. And there was a row over coalition, as there always is in the Labour Party. But they had a row, and I think it was Mick O'Reilly wanted to fight the election on a joint programme with Fine Gael. And that was a step too far for many, many people on the left. Even people who would go along with a coalition with Fine Gael afterwards, but didn't want to fight on a common programme. They wanted the Labour Party to fight on their programme and then use their programme to negotiate afterwards. Anyway, that was the concept of the debate that went on. And Jimmy Tinkler had gone a different way. He supported Mick O'Reilly. And I started a row in the union over this. And as a result of that, Barry Merrigan said to me, well, Nick, it's not enough to be giving out about what other people do. If you're going to be talking about the Labour Party and giving out about the Labour Party, you better bloody well join it. So I did. I joined the Labour Party, and I was on the executive of I was elected to the executive of the fourth conference. In fact, I remember questioning myself, can this be a serious organisation? I'm 2.5 minutes in and I'm already on the executive. I was not impressed by the fact that wouldn't happen to you in the Communist Party. Law was much, much smaller. But nevertheless, you'd have to serve some kind of an apprenticeship. But anyway, I went to my first conference. Literally, I was 3 months in the Labour Party, and I found myself in the middle of this huge debate about coalition and all the rest of it. And we established a co-op called the Labour Left Co-op. We produced a magazine, and we challenged the direction of the Labour Party in relation to coalition in particular, particularly the coalition at that time. It was very, very right-wing. Now, a lot of people think Gareth Fitzgerald was a left-wing kind of a guy or a progressive sort of person. I don't. That's not a view I share. And I'm opposed to Fine Gael. I would have even argued that it would be much better if Labour had even been in coalition with Fianna Fáil, and I eventually supported that kind of an outcome. Anyway, the Labour Party was full of arguments and factions, and it was a completely new kind of situation for me. You could be in the Labour Party and have any kind of a view that you wanted and argue it out. It was open, and there were huge differences between people. That's very different from a Communist Party, which is very focused on what it has to do. After it has the debate, it turns around and it tries to carry out.
Is that an advantage or a disadvantage, in your opinion, Mick, for a party to have such free debate?
I think it's an absolute advantage for a party to have as much debate as possible. But I think when the debate is finished, you have to set about, making sure the debate reflects itself in unity and in taking the party forward. The problem with the Labour Party debates were that we usually lost and they'd come out in favour of coalition. And the problem, there was a minority in the Labour Party, which if you kept up, the idea of supporting the coalition, it would eventually lead to a situation that would destroy the Labour Party because it would lose its whole compass about what it was about. It's all right, maybe in an extreme crisis now and again, to go into a situation of power with people who have a totally different view from you because of some national crisis. But it's quite another thing to make it, to make yourself part of the status quo forever. And that's essentially what they were doing. And a lot of it was about office rather than power to do things. They didn't achieve an awful lot in government.
Well, Mick, one of the things that runs throughout your book is your relationship with Mick O'Reilly and your friendship too. Could you talk about that, please?
Oh, well, it was a big friendship, actually, but it wasn't a friendship that we agreed on things. I mean, it's very hard. I am somebody who is totally opposed to the ideas of Mick in terms of his devotion to the Soviet Union and all of that. That is not the kind of communism I was ever interested in whatsoever. I don't think that was it. In fact, my view is if we had created if one of the communist parties, one of the big communist parties in France or Italy had come to power, that would have been great for the Soviet Union because it would have helped them to give them the confidence to dismantle some of the military machine that they have and spend it looking after their own people. They had to put an awful lot of resources into military stuff, which, in some ways crippled what they were trying to do. But I wasn't the great admirer of the Soviet Union. But anyway, Mick was. That's neither here nor there. The fact is, Mick O'Reilly was a tremendous internationalist. He was a great Irish Republican. I would argue that he was a great Irish patriot. And he'd done so much for me. But as I say, I didn't always agree with this. In fact, I hardly ever agreed on anything. But we were great friends because he was somebody I admired. I admired him because, he retired from the movement and spent a lifetime in it, and he wouldn't have had 2 blades of grass to put together. But, he was a man you didn't meet every day. If you met him, you knew you met him. If he had a point of view, he'd stick with it. He wouldn't abandon any post because it was difficult. He got a commendation from the International Brigade over his role in Spain. And I think it reads something like this. I'm talking from memory now. He is usually the first into any battle. He's usually the last to leave. His small submachine gun is equal to 14 fascists. Now, I don't think they gave loads of them out. So that was the Mick O'Reilly I knew, and as I say, I had great time for him. I liked him, I respected him, but as I said, I did not agree with the kind of world I think he wanted to create here. But on the other hand, he was solid on the national question when a lot of people were not. He believed in the British disengagement from this island. He was a friend of Irish Republicans when it was very difficult to be their friend. He supported the Adams leadership, I think, in Sinn Féin, and he thought that it would create the right kind of set of circumstances. And on most everything else, apart from Soviet Union, most things in relation to Ireland, me and Mick would have had an agreement, you know. But I remember saying to him one day, I actually thought he was going to hit me. He was trying to change my mind on the invasion of Czechoslovakia, and I was unemployed at the time, and he used to buy me 4 pints of stout and give me bus fare. I had absolutely no money. I used to have 38 shillings a week on the assistance, and my rent was 18 shillings. You can figure out the rest. This was not an easy period of my life. Anyway, I was working for Mick. He was talking to me about Lenin and revisionism, and talking to me all day long. And it was like white noise in my ear, the pain of it. And I finally got fed up with him. And we were walking down Marylebone Lane, and I said to him, "Do you think all that's right?" He said, "Yes, I do." And I said, "Well, I don't." And I said, "If you do, why don't you do a pamphlet for yourself?" I said, "and say that you were a bricklayer on the Berlin Wall and a tank driver in Hungary, and see how that goes down in Panama Mansions." Well,
Wow.
when I looked at his face, I saw he was going to flatten me. Like, Mick was a big man. He was in every way. Anyway, I got that frightened. I stood down off the path to make myself smaller, right? And anyway, we walked down to Catherine's church, and usually we go in for our 4 points, and he just turned on his heel and said good night. Anyway, the next morning I met him, and it was all gone. It was how you make gun, and the next night I done my bit, and we had our 4 points. So that's the kind of guy he was. He could argue with you quickly, but he would forget about it. And he would, you know, there was no. I never found him to be narrow-minded or anything like that. And I tell you something else. When I was sacked in the union, Mick was a great supporter of mine. Absolutely fantastic. I mean, he had contacts in Britain that helped me get the job as the regional secretary of the Transport Union, which was a big, very difficult job for me to get. And Mick was, you know, he was a supporter of mine. And when I was sacked, he was one of the people who supported me. I remember being in Fleet Street outside the book shop, and I got a phone call on my mobiles telling me that the full-time officers in the union had voted by 70% to go on strike and support me and Eugene McGowan. Now, just think about what that means. That is like union officials going on strike. It just doesn't happen. You know, it would be like people said, "Well, you know, we're TDs now, and we're not going to service our constituents. We're full-time officials, and we're not going to look after our members." I mean, other unions would just take all your members. It was a huge, huge thing that I done. And Mick O'Reilly called me over, and I said, "I'm after getting word to the officers," and he said, "You will be back. Morris," he said, "is dead." He said, "It's like the Cardinals voting against the Pope. Nobody can stand that," Mick. He said, "You'll get your job back." And he was right. I did.
Yeah, you've mentioned you know, the controversy with you and the ATGW, Mick. We're going to get onto that in a second. I've just have one more quick question about like Irish politics of that era. Like, you mentioned that you joined the Labour Party after the Communist Party, and Mick O'Reilly obviously stayed with the Communist Party. There was another outgrowth on the Irish left at the time, which was the Workers' Party. Were you ever tempted to join them?
No.
Okay.
I told you, I learned about my republicanism late. But when I came to it, I believed it. I believe in the independence of Ireland. I believe that we should control our own destinies. And I believe in a disengagement from the British state, from all things Irish. The official Republican movement didn't agree with that. They abandoned it. And I think they've done themselves a great the same because of it. But anyway, that's only.
I mean, the main thing you were involved in, Mick, was the trade union movement. And I think the 80s was the highest proportion of Irish workers in trade unions, wasn't it?
Yes, very good.
When did it start to decline?
It declined for many reasons. There's not one reason. Part of it is the changing nature of work. What you might call the collapse of the three M's. That's male, manual, manufacturing. That has, made a big impact. The collapse of that kind of work has made a big impact on the trade union movement culturally and every other way. That's one part of it. The other part of it, I would argue, is this. It was getting involved in kind of national wage agreements, where we got involved and we had a 3-year agreement and everything came down from the top. And so we had this huge movement, involving maybe more than 500,000 people, probably thousands of shop stewards and officials and all the rest of it. And they had nothing to do. All they do is police these agreements and make sure that they're carried out. That makes sense if you're in the public sector, but it doesn't make any sense if you're in the private sector. And I am firmly of the view that free collective bargaining, in other words, meeting your own employer, figuring out your own company, making your demands on the employer, and looking after your own members and involving them democratically in the discussion about where we go and what we do and all the rest of it. That's what trade unionism is. And if you have this big wet blanket on the movement and it lies over it for 20 years, then all your muscles atrophy. You don't use them. So that's also part of the trade union. And when they got a wallop, they did, as a result of the economic crisis, they were very, very badly injured because a lot of their muscle power, their capacity to fight, was gone from them. And I remember in the trade union movement when we got rid of words like when we stopped calling one another comrade, when we stopped talking about class politics, when we started talking about everything being rational. I'll tell you this, the employers have never stopped talking about class politics. I mean, as far as they're concerned, they have a quite simple attitude. They're in the business of making money out of our members. And if we want to support them in doing that, hey, that's great. But if we don't, they'll fight us. But if we don't learn to stand up for our members and become fighting back trade unions, what's the point of trade unionism? We're not there as a prop for the status quo, as a prop for the state. Our job is to look after our members. Our job is to look after our members independently of what the state wants or what political parties want. We have to listen to our members. And we haven't been doing that, I'm afraid. And, there's a lot of problems in the trade union movement. But I mean, at the end of the day, the trade union movement is still one of the biggest organizations in this country. And people should join it. They should fight for change in it. And there'll be no change in Ireland without changes in the trade union movement and the involvement of the trade union movement.
Well, Mick, I might ask you about the ATGWU. And there might be some people who wouldn't be aware that this is a British-based union and the different history involved of unions with a headquarters in Britain remaining active within Ireland and the Irish trade union movement. Could you speak about that, please?
Well, first of all, the unions that made up the ATGWU were active in Ireland right through many of them before the state was founded. So when the state was founded, they didn't cut off their connections with Britain, so to speak. They just remained in operation. And remember, the biggest union which broke away from Britain was the Irish Transport and General Workers Union. And it didn't break away because of the War of Independence. It broke away because Larkin had a row and it wouldn't give him the autonomy that he wanted to be able to fight, to make the Irish Transport a more fighting back union that responded quicker to the needs of the Irish membership. It wasn't in that sense a political construct in the beginning. Obviously, it was influenced hugely by the Connolly's involvement in 1916 and all of that. But the union that I was in, and I should just say that I wasn't originally in the Transport and General Workers Union, I was in a union called the National Union of Vehicle Builders, and we merged with the Transport Union in the early 70s. It would be the biggest union in Britain and the second biggest union in Ireland. 2/3 of its members were in the north of Ireland in 6 counties, and 1/3 down here. But it was a very, very militant left-wing union. Now, it wasn't always like that. You know, there was a period in the 50s when the Transport Union was a very anti-communist union. Its leader, Arthur Deakin, actually banned the communists from holding office. Many of them lost their jobs because you couldn't be a full-time official in the union or represent the members. The Cold War operation, the same operated in the Irish Union, not by rule, but by culture. There was a very, very big attack on communists in the trade union movement, particularly when it was dying out when we joined it, but it was still there. You know, it was still there. There was a fierce mistrust of communists. And ultimately, people thought you were working for a foreign state rather than you were part of the. Because I always say the ideas of Larkin and Connolly are not foreign to me. They're part of Irish culture. But for other people, because of their association with the Soviet Union, or with the way it got looked at, the involvement of Marxism in Irish culture became obscured and totally associated with, as I say, the Soviet Union. The Transport and General Workers Union operated here, and I joined it. It was a very left-wing union, and I really liked its culture. It had a very robust internal culture. It was very democratic, very much based on rank-and-file trade unionism, and a very political union. And I got the job in the Transport Union in 1978. The General Secretary, no, he actually kind of left the year I got the job. I never really worked alongside him, but I knew him. The General Secretary was a man called James Larkin Jones, known in Britain as Jack Jones. The reason is he got the name Larkin was his father was involved in the 1913 strike in Liverpool and was responsible for collecting a lot of money for the people here who were on strike. And of course, Jack Jones was born in 1913.
So, Mick, you've alluded already to your split with the ATGW and that Bill Morris, who was the head of the union, suspended you. That was really in the context of the social partnership idea that you were talking about a few minutes ago, wasn't it?
No, it wasn't really. I was involved in controversy here with the social partnership with the Irish brothers. Morris mightn't have liked some of the things I was doing in relation to social partnership. I don't know. No, it was for a whole number of reasons. I mean, culturally, he probably didn't like the way I run the region from a very much a rank and file perspective. I try to involve people in the union in ways that maybe he didn't like. The truth of it is this: I don't really know, because he never really had a proper kind of argument with me. I believe, you know, if somebody's doing something wrong in the union, you should go over and have a row with them and point out this or the other. Nothing like that ever happened to me. This came at me from out of the blue, you know. And I have to tell you, you know, it's not a union that lightly sacks people. So he sacked me and he sacked Eugene McGlone, and yeah, there was a lot of stuff circulating here, and journalists have told me that people from the Irish trade union movement were involved in talking to him and about my role, but I have no evidence that was the case. I genuinely haven't, you know. Certainly, I was having arguments with them over wage agreements, and I was making the weather on the wage agreements all over the place, and I think I was making good arguments. But I mean, they weren't happy with that. But that's, you know, not my job to make them happy. It's my job to look after my members.
Well, Mick, reading through the book, I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for yourself to have this hanging over you for such a long time. And also, I suppose, the perception that people would have that if a trade union official is suspended, there must be some financial impropriety, or they must have done something very, very bad to warrant this.
Well, in a country awash with tribunals, read Jane Kerrigan's introduction. I mean, the fact that an interview was done on RTE, a perfectly legitimate interview, and the journalist concerned said to the question, was there an audit? Will there be an audit? An audit is a great word. And on Morning Ireland, of course, the answer was yes. Everything is going to be audited, but you really audit money. And I think a lot of people said, oh, well, you know, Mick might be a nice guy, but he obviously had his hand in the cookie jar and so on and so forth. And that just lay there. It just lay there over us for a period of months. And it was very difficult because, you see, we were banned from speaking. We were told we could not speak to any person or thing that the union had an association with. Any person or thing. That's a big That's it's a small few words, but it has a big meaning. And that letter was handed to me in Belfast. And I have to say, I was dumbfounded by it. It was like getting 2 barrels of a gun and my head blown off. I just come back from holidays, and it was really shocking. But it was very difficult for me, because if some employer or in some dispute that had happened to me, that wouldn't have bothered me, getting knocked down and dusting myself off. But it was the idea that I'd have to fight the union. I couldn't get it into my head that I'd have to fight this union. We're not wanting to sound sloppy about it. I love the union. I really do. And it was very, very difficult for me to get that into my head. And I went back, and I remember I read Greaves's book on James Connolly. Within days, really, of this happened to me. And he says somewhere in the book that you commit yourself twice if you're a real revolutionary to change. Well, this was my second time to commit myself, because I needed to kind of refuel and ask myself the question, what was my life all about? What was this all about? And I concluded that I wasn't actually attacking the union. I was helping to save it. I was attacking people who had lost their way in the union. And I think Bill Morris lost his way in the union. And if you doubt that, just imagine where he is now. He's in the House of Lords.
Yeah, maybe it's unfair.
Well, I'm in Drimna.
Yeah, maybe it's an unfair thing to bring up for Bill Morris, but I mean, many people would have been aware in the 90s of the Liverpool Dockers dispute, and he certainly appeared unsympathetic then to the Dockers.
Oh, he did, and I campaigned with the Dockers, which probably didn't do me any good in the union. Anyway, that's not there. I campaigned with the Dockers, and I supported them. I collected a lot of money for them, and I helped them stop a couple of votes down here, and was involved with them. And I remember within 3 days of being elected as regional secretary, which was a huge shock, because Morris didn't want me as regional secretary, no doubt about that. And he always was able to pick. See, you have to understand, the transport union, the regional secretaries are a power base in the union. They are the most important, powerful people in the union, alongside the general secretary. Right? It's a spare kind of power. It's always been like that. And the Irish region is, fairly autonomous thing, and he certainly didn't want me in it. And I don't know why. He probably would have been a bit dubious about my republicanism, because I had, campaigned in Britain for a British disengagement from Ireland. I'd spoken on platforms with Benedict Evelyn and Ken Livingstone and Tony Benn and what have you. So, he might have been happy about that kind of thing. And a number of our members wouldn't have been happy over it as well. We have a unionist membership. But you have to, sometimes you have to state what your politics are, and that's that. And I never apologise for the fact that I'm an Irish Republican. I don't shy away from campaigning for my Republican views. So, there was all of that. And as I say, I was elected on the executive, I think it was 18 votes to 12, which is huge when the General Secretary is campaigning against you. It's huge. So mostly Morris got his way. So that was the background to all of that. And we just didn't see eye to eye. Although I do remember actually talking to him one time, and he come back to me and said, he said, I was at a Sinn Féin, a Friends of Sinn Féin meeting in London. He said, and I met this fella, Martin McGuinness. He said, he's the most charming individual I ever met in my life. I must have made some inroads in them, but I don't know what happened in London, why they turned on me the way they did. There are 101 theories about it. Frankly, I'd probably never know.
Well, ultimately, Mick, you were vindicated, and
completely.
Yeah,
completely. John Handy done a report on it, and he fairly well lays out what happened. But that took nearly 3.5 years.
Yeah, it's dreadful to think that the amount of stress and worry and the unnecessary nature of the whole thing.
That's true, but these things happen. When the brothers fall out, it's just the worst of all times. Because the brothers are not supposed to fall out. But if you look at if you look at, what are the worst kind of wars? They're civil wars. And the worst kind of things that happen, usually they happen in one union, one to another. They don't happen very often, but when they happen, they are awful. And it was an awful period, there's no doubt. And I'm sad about it because it diminished everybody. It diminished everybody, but it diminished the union. And I think, without wanting to sound cocky or the fact that I won and that was reinstated, I think it diminished Bill Morris as well. I think it done him a lot of harm. Because when he left, there wasn't a big turnout at his party, and a lot of people who had campaigned for him, as indeed I did in the fourth election, felt very let down by him. But anyway, these things, once you start on a road like that, they get legs. And I venture to say, in the trade union movement, historically, if you look at people being sacked, they never get back. You usually get a big bag of money and told them to go away and shut up. But I got back, and I think, and Eugene got back, and I think that's unique. Now, I'm not a Labour historian, though I do dabble a bit in history. I've never come across a row so big that we were able to turn it around, because it's one of the biggest unions in the world.
What's your thoughts on the future of trade unionism and left-wing politics in Ireland today?
Well, obviously, on the question of politics, obviously, the left need to cooperate, try and develop, work together, and put a formula together for a progressive alternative government. And that must involve Sinn Féin, who are the biggest party now on the left, and it must also involve the independent people, and probably the remnants of Labour, the Social Democrats, and even the Greens, dare I say it, even though it doesn't look like they'd be in anything now. And that's the kind of a coalition we have to put together with the support of the trade union movement. And that's, I think, the future of the left. The future of the trade union movement, they need to reach out to the workers in the new industries. They need to learn to listen to them. They need to find out where the shoe is tight for them, get them involved in the trade union movement, and recruit. That's the future of trade unionism, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, Mick, thank you very much. We really appreciate having you on the show today. If anyone would like to get Mick's book, it's called From Lucifer to Lazarus, A Life on the Left, and it's available by Lilliput Press. And I'm sure you can get it now in most good bookshops and also order it online. You can follow us on Twitter at Irish History Pod, or on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. And if you get a chance, please take a moment to rate and review the show on iTunes, Spotify, or whichever platform you get your podcasts on. It really does help us. So don't forget, you can listen back to all the previous episodes of the show on irishhistoryshow.ie. So on behalf of myself, Cathal Brennan, and my co-presenter, John Dorney from theirishstory.com, until next time, thank you very much for listening.
Radio.ie hosts the Irish History Show podcast because history matters. Radio turns 100 years young this year. Radio's history is powered by radio archives. For radio archiving solutions from people passionate about radio, visit radio.ie.